Hi, my name's Kevin Martin. Thanks for joining me this week. This is the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program's weekly podcast update. We are not only through with harvest, but we are through our processor winter meetings. Cooperatives, cash markets alike, the ones that have the annual meetings, have had them and have updated their growers on a number of different things, where they think the market is going, what this past harvest looked like in summary. For the most part, quality has been very good across all of our processors, across all of our growing region. There have been a few exceptions. There were some issues with, I think we thought a lot of growers were taking a lot of risk with the size of their crop. We had a wonderful September, and we made out just fine, except for the vineyards that were most extremely overcropped. There were some penalties by processors that issue penalties, and there were some rejections as well. It probably wasn't enough by any stretch of the imagination to impact total tonnage or gross revenue for most farmers, but for a few individual farmers, it would probably be quite a hardship and a good reminder, I think, to the rest of us to continue to manage based on crop load, try to maximize that crop load as best we can without overdoing it, try to keep things in balance and be sustainable. With that being said, a lot of the discussion that growers were having around this meeting was around the capital investments. I think the conclusion was that we are at the beginning of a cycle for Concords of higher prices. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to translate to higher prices for growers. It already has to some extent. How far that will go, I think, is a bit of a mystery, but to be a grape grower is to be an optimist. So there are some plans for some capital improvements, but there is also, I think, some disagreement because we are coming off of such a negative down cycle in terms of the belief that the industry will prosper and older growers having succession plans. How do we make these capital investments properly and sustainably, and what makes the most sense to improve efficiency? One of the big topics of discussion was upgrading to bulk. Recently, the Westfield plant for National Grape went bulk, and that opened the door for a lot of people. It happened not necessarily at the best time to run out and spend $100,000 for most growers, but there was a little bit of adoption early on, and there may be some more in the future. The other processors are starting to discuss the issue, and once that happens, there will be some more opportunities for growers to adopt this more modern system for transferring grapes from the field to the plant. And I wanted to talk about the numbers, and I know I've done this before. I'll try to talk about it a different way this time. What it takes for this sort of system to make sense for your operation. And the dynamics of the New York State labor policy have changed how this is going to work in New York State, because the big savings when you switch to bulk is labor. There's also some savings associated with equipment, specifically tractor hours that are no longer being used, but a lot of it has to do with labor. And as labor gets more expensive, it becomes more important to reduce that labor cost. So with 120 acres, I think this is where we're really struggling with trying to understand what bulk looks like. And to me, at 120 acres, if that's what you harvest with no custom work at all, it's very clear that a big year, when you're doing 8 tons to the acre, for most of our growers, that's a pretty big year, especially if you're located in Northeast or Westfield. You don't have a lot of turn time for your trucks. It's going to sound crazy, but it makes sense to have one tractor trailer. You harvest approximately 1 load per day on average, and the turn time and delay in having that truck full, if you're trying to do 2 loads in one day, is worth the savings when you upgrade, and you'll offset it in a big way by the savings you have in labor. So what that means is your adoption costs are about $63,000. $15,000 for the MOG, $25,000 for the gondolas, $23,000 for the trailers, or the bulk bins that go on the trailers. So what do you need to do? For your MOG, that's going to be paid off in full after you harvest about 1,300 acres. The gondolas, that's going to be paid off in full after about 500 acres. And the trailers are by themselves less of a savings. It's going to take about 3,500 acres. So if you view this as a system where you're not going to have the MOG unless you have the gondolas, you're not going to have the gondolas unless you have the bulk bins on the trailers, the total $63,000 is repaid after harvesting 990 or 1,000 acres or in 8.2 years. Now that is assuming your employees during harvest are paid the New York State minimum wage, they incur a little bit of overtime working on that seventh day or working just over 60 hours. That is the state of the labor market right now based on New York State's minimum wage. We know that minimum wage is going to rise, but it does include all of the factors in terms of the labor law changes that New York State made. I would predict by 2022, because of rising labor costs, that 8.2 years will be more like 6.5. And this is for that 120-acre grower. For different growers, these numbers are going to look a lot different. If your 4 or 5 employees are all unpaid, their family that are involved in the farm, it's going to take longer, especially from a cash flow perspective, for this to make sense. Maybe it doesn't make sense at all. If you run 3 trailers with 3 bins on each for 9 bins, and you're pulling them with tractors that are 30 years old, and you do the maintenance yourself, and it's relatively inexpensive, again, it's going to take longer to make this, for this to make sense. But for growers running relatively new equipment, sort of purchased in the last 10 or 15 years, and actually using paid labor during harvest, which is fairly common during harvest, this 8.2 years in New York State, given the current state of the market, and 6.5 years in the next couple of years, I think that's where it's trending. I hate to speculate beyond 2022, but I would say the payback period will actually be faster because I would expect wages to continue to rise. Pennsylvania will also look a little bit different, but not a lot. I don't think a lot of people are paying anywhere near minimum wage in Pennsylvania for harvest help. If they are, then their numbers will look a lot different, and it will take more acreage for this kind of system to make sense. When you hit 150 acres, or you start to get very far away from Westfield Northeast where the processing plants are, you're going to need more trailers. The turn time is going to be more of an issue. At 250 acres, you're certainly going to have about $87,000 invested in this equipment, and that relates directly to the purchase of 2 additional bulk bins on trailers. What that means, though, is you are harvesting more grapes, you're incurring more labor costs, so you'll actually see a payback period much faster. Again, the trailers by themselves save the least, but most of our growers view this as a system and don't purchase gondolas in the field until they have bulk bins on their trailers. So 5.5 years, given the current state of the labor market in New York State, probably 6.5 in Pennsylvania for a grower that harvests 250 acres. Looking forward, I would expect that to drop right around to 4 years. All this stuff, these are great assets. They're made out of stainless steel. They're relatively reliable. Given the state of the market, if you are as optimistic as most people are, it certainly makes sense, if you need to finance these purchases with payback periods of anywhere from 6.5 to 4 years. If you fall into that range, you will cash flow immediately. So your debt service on this equipment will be about the same as your labor savings costs, especially for that 250 acre harvester. So to me, that's how the numbers work, and I think we kind of touched on why they don't work for some people, whether it's unpaid labor or older equipment that is being maintained less expensively than it would be if it were being maintained sort of on a fair market value, if you were taking it to get repaired or paying a repairman. All of those elements do factor into the assumptions that I'm operating under. I will say that payback period could be faster. One of the things I didn't assume is any downtime. So when you have multiple breakdowns in the field and your harvesting time exceeds 2 hours per load, or if you're doing less than 3 acres per hour because of whatever it happens to be, a belt that malfunctions or a fan, the less your labor costs, the better this works. So, if you have downtime and you're paying less people to stand around, the downtime would probably realistically cut the payback period by a year, but it is going to depend a lot on the reliability of your equipment, which varies a lot from farm to farm. It depends a lot on what you're doing with your equipment. So I didn't really want to speculate and make assumptions about that, but if anything, the payback period would actually be faster. I would say the same thing about low-yielding vineyards. So this assumes 8 tons per acre because I think as you make these capital investments, you don't want to be caught when you have a large crop with not enough equipment to contain your crop. So this assumes 8-9 tons per acre. You can handle it. You'll see more substantial savings in smaller crop years because the labor costs really do not decline. They're really based almost entirely on how many acres you're harvesting, not how many tons you're harvesting. So as we reduce the number of tons we harvest, we don't save too much in labor. And essentially you typically have people standing around. And there are some opportunities with bulk to eliminate those people from standing around because of some efficiencies in how the field gondolas transport product to the truck. We certainly see under 4 tons per acre and even under 5 tons per acre harvesting small family farms. They're harvesting with 2 people, so their paid labor goes right to zero in the years where they have lower yields. Which I think is great news from a cash flow perspective. It really allows you to control your own destiny. You're not going to be able to name your price for this commodity, and you're also not really in control of the price of your labor. So when you eliminate paid labor, you remove that risk from the equation. And the growers that are harvesting 120 acres or less can certainly do that. And growers who are harvesting 250 acres or less, some of them are doing it in that range as well, depending on the organization of their business and what kind of unpaid labor they have access to. But I would say, for the most part, it's a very reasonable investment. I think part of the hardship, part of the struggle with understanding is you're essentially doing the same thing. You are transporting grapes in bins in the field to bins on a trailer to the plant. So fundamentally, theoretically speaking, nothing is changing except things get shinier. And I think we have noticed all along, as growers have, that shiny paint syndrome is a problem in the industry. As you can reduce your capital investment, an older harvester can harvest 250 acres just as well as a newer harvester can. So why replace it every 5 years? The same goes for this type of equipment, so why would we buy it? But I think there are some fundamental differences with how this equipment works that actually allows it to work faster. It's kind of like comparing a multi-row sprayer to a single-row sprayer. It's not like comparing a shiny new single-row sprayer to an older single-row sprayer. It's different technology, and it saves quite a bit of labor. It's just kind of my 2 cents. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to comment below. If you want some help or want to see how we can help you run some numbers for your own farm, feel free to give us a call. I'd be happy to do that for you. Thanks for joining me this week. And again, any questions, please let us know. Thank you.